Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 286 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be looking at how to effectively use the gap between your emotion and your response to that emotion. I'll elaborate on that more later. This is a great way for getting used to doing things in the moment and responding in the moment to tricky situations. So let's unpack more about this interesting topic right now. So in the Second World War, there was a psychiatrist called Viktor Frankl, who was an Austrian, and he was incarcerated in the concentration camps during the Second World War. And he subsequently wrote a book, which is quite popular these days. And I know it's got a bit of a resurgence at the moment as well, I've noticed. And it's called Man's Search for Meaning. And one of the things he talks about in the book, and I'm paraphrasing here, was he noticed that there was a tendency for some people in the concentration camps to respond better than others to the situation they were in. So obviously it's a horrible situation, everyone's under stress there, and certain people, he noticed, seem to respond more positively to the environment than others. And he was interested, as a psychiatrist, why is that? What was going on there? What were some people doing that was making them more able to handle the horrible situation than others? And he came to the conclusion that there is a gap between the emotions we experience and the response that we take, or the behavior or the action we take after that. And so basically his concept was that you have the power to choose your response, even in the face of strong emotions. And I think that's a really interesting way to put this. And basically it goes like this. If you think about this example, some sort of event happens. So, someone speaks over you in a meeting, someone hits your car in traffic, someone speaks rudely to you, whatever it is. Now that's an event. Now you will automatically have an emotional response to that event. And when I talk about emotional response, I'm talking about the chemical reaction that happens, which is your emotion. And that's automatic. We can't turn off emotions. We can't just say, well, don't feel bad, or no, don't get angry, right? You have that emotion automatically. Then what Viktor Frankl realized was there's a gap there between the emotion and the actual response that you take to respond to that emotion, like the action you take or the behavior or what you say. And so in that gap is where the power is, which means I can choose the response that I want to take in that moment. So what I want to talk about today is, how do you use that gap really effectively? And what are some little strategies you can use to make the most of that gap? So that if something happens at work in your leadership and you have to respond, how do you use that gap effectively, or make the most of that gap so that you can respond in a constructive way? I remember many years ago, I was leading a project at the time, and it was quite stressful, and an external vendor, like a supplier, had really underperformed. They'd stuffed something up and they hadn't paid proper attention to the quality of what they were doing. And it caused delays, and we were already under a lot of pressure. And I remember I was so stressed at the time, I had an emotional outburst where I basically yelled at them, which is out of character for me. I don't usually do that sort of thing. And I still to this day think about that. And of course, after the event, I apologized and tried to make things a little bit better. But the point was, I did not use the gap effectively in that situation. I basically went straight from emotion, which was anger or frustration, to action, which was to yell at the person and tell them they did a crappy job. And there's lots of different ways I could have handled that better. So this is when I got really interested in this gap concept and, what is this and how can we make the use of this gap? All right. So how can you make the most of the gap? And these little techniques are cool to try and to practice and to think for your own examples, because it'll depend on who you are and what your preferences are in terms of how you respond to these techniques. Now, one of them is very simple, and I heard this on an interview a few years ago with a high-level banking executive, and someone was interviewing him and saying to him, "Oh, how do you maintain your composure when you're in the courtroom and the judge is, or someone is questioning you, the lawyers are questioning you on fraud allegations and all this sort of stuff?" Now, this person wasn't a criminal, but he had to front the tribunal for various banking issues. And he basically said one of the things he does to stay calm is to always have a drink of water available, so a glass of water or a bottle of water. So when someone asks a tough question, he can take a sip of that water, and he has, in that moment, created a little gap for himself of 2 to 3 seconds where he's drinking the water, where he can start to go, okay, what am I going to say? How am I going to respond to this thing? And you might think, well, that's not very much time, and it's not. But actually, once you do that more often, you'll get practiced at that, and your mind can come up with something while you're taking that little break. So I thought that was a pretty cool one in terms of very simple, because often you have a drink of water or a drink of coffee next to you, whatever it is, in a meeting, for example. And if you have to, in the moment, respond, you can take a sip of water first to give yourself that space so that you don't just act on your immediate impulse necessarily. The second interesting way I thought that I've heard before, and I run training sessions, and sometimes we talk about, okay, what are your ways that you can use this gap? And another one is taking a breath, and that's very simple, but you might take a deep breath before you respond to something. So in a meeting, maybe something happens and you get annoyed or frustrated, and you just take a breath, take a deep breath. It's something that you can do quite easily. People won't necessarily notice you doing it, but you can do that to maintain a sense of calm in the moment. Another technique I've heard people use, which I think is quite interesting, is to recite a nursery rhyme in your head, which sounds silly, but what that can sometimes do is kick in your thinking brain, or your neurocortex in your brain, which is the thinking logic part of the brain, and it can prevent that fight or flight response from taking over. So sometimes people recite a nursery rhyme in their head to stop the automatic fight or flight response, which can happen. Another thing that people like to do, and I do this myself sometimes, is to say some sort of a mantra to themselves. Like some people might say, stay calm, or take a breath, or it's okay, or pause, or I've got this. Whatever it is, whatever your own personal mantra is, can be a really handy thing. And so saying a mantra in your head, or even quietly to yourself, could be a way to give yourself that little pause to help you choose your response instead of acting automatically. Another simple thing that people do is they take a pause, and they do things like count to 3 in their head, for example, and that once again gives you a little bit of space. Because in a tense situation, like a meeting or something like that, you might feel like you have to respond immediately, but actually, if you give yourself a couple of seconds, no one's really going to notice that. What they might do is perceive you as a more calm and in control leader, because you're taking the time to respond and gather your thoughts rather than blurt them out automatically. Another technique that I've used in the past, which is really useful, and a lot of people favor this one as well, is maybe you get a dodgy email that really annoys you, and your temptation is to immediately fire back and respond in an aggressive way about that email. Now, there's a couple of different ways to handle that. Sometimes you can leave it, you can write your response, leave it as a draft and don't send it till the next day, or wait a couple of hours. Or you simply wait till the next day to respond to that email. So you force yourself to not email back straight away. And often that gives you the space to process that more effectively. Another technique that sometimes people use is they ask a colleague, they write their response, and then they say to their colleague, hey, can you read this for me? Is this an okay email? And sometimes people say, well, no, I wouldn't send that because you sound really aggressive. And that allows you to tone it down. So depending on the situation, you can incorporate the gap this way, which is to leave an email for tomorrow or get someone to review it or something like that. So that can be another one. And another simple way to use this gap between your emotion and response is to simply take a break. And that is go outside, go for a walk, go get a coffee, exit your current situation if you can. And that can be appropriate also if you're in a tense discussion with someone and you suggest, hey, let's just take a break for a few minutes and we'll come back and reconvene. So these sort of things are useful to be able to provide that gap between your emotion and your response. And obviously I've listed about 7 of them here, and there's lots of different ones you could choose. So it's really up to you to decide what you think will work for you. So I'd encourage you to do this. And obviously this sort of technique is part of self-management. So if we talk about emotional intelligence as a topic, there are 4 domains to emotional intelligence. The first one is self-awareness, which is basically awareness of your own emotions. Then the second one is self-management, which is being able to manage your response to those emotions. The third one is social awareness, which is about understanding other people's emotions and reading the room effectively. And then the fourth one is relationship management, which is all about managing the situation when you're sensing emotions in others. So this episode is really dealing with the topic of self-management, which is something that a lot of people find a struggle, particularly if they're at work and they feel frustrated and upset or angry. They do sometimes find it hard. And self-management was always my hardest one to improve. I always found it tricky to basically improve my self-management, which is why I started also doing activities like mindfulness meditation, which I do every day in the morning for 10 minutes. And that over time is another way to actually help yourself become more in tune with your emotions and the way your body feels so that you can be aware when you're shifting into a heightened state. You might be getting upset or frustrated or angry. What I noticed many years ago after doing mindfulness meditation for, probably 6 months or so, I started to notice that in meetings, for example, when I was stressed, my shoulders would rise gradually and I would notice, oh, my shoulders are tense and they're going up. And then I would know, oh, something's making me stressed in this meeting. All right, let's calm down, let's relax my shoulders. And I would be able to use that as a little trigger to tell me what's going on in the environment and to automatically calm myself down so I can respond better. So yeah, mindfulness meditation is another one that I'd recommend. I actually use for that the Waking Up app, which is by a neuroscientist called Sam Harris. I really like Sam's work. So you can check that out as well. It is a paid app, but there are many others that you can use as well, such as, apps like Headspace, and there's many others, I'm sure. I'll put all these links and references to the books and things that I talked about today in the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/286. Got the podcast there in the middle now, so I won't forget that. Okay, and just before we finish, if you think you could benefit from working with me one-to-one, I do a lot of coaching with individual thoughtful leaders, and a lot of the things we work on are improving leadership confidence, dealing with tricky team members and situations, and a lot of time management, stress management, all those sorts of good things as well. So if you think you could benefit from working with me, feel free to reach out and book in a free coaching consultation. I'll put a link on the show notes page to my coaching page and you can check out all my coaching stuff, including the fees I charge as well, because I like to be quite open about the fees I charge so that there's no surprises there. So if you're interested, please go to that show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/286 and check out my leadership coaching page there as well. All right. That brings us to the close of this particular episode about using the gap and managing the response to your emotions. I hope you found it useful, and I'm interested in what your techniques are, your go-to techniques for using this gap and responding constructively. Let me know on the show notes page in the comments, or if you're on Spotify, feel free to leave a comment there as well. That'd be great to hear your thoughts on this one. And don't forget, if you like the podcast, put in a 5-star rating for me. It really helps me get the word out and helps other thoughtful leaders just like you find this podcast. All right. Thank you for listening. Keep up the thoughtful leadership as usual, and I'll be back next week.